Welcome back to What's New with Mead. We're in episode 54, and I have the wonderful couple from Flying Bee Ranch with me. They are Delcy and Jeremy, and unfortunately, Delcy is not with us this evening, but Jeremy is here to talk to us all about bees and honey and the amazing varietals he has there at Flying Bee Ranch, and kind of give us an inner workings of what really happens in a honey company. So, Jeremy, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Garrett, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and chat with the viewers.
Yeah. Well, I'm super excited, especially to kind of gather a greater understanding of honey. I feel like I've used so much of it, and I have like the basic understanding, scientific understanding that, bee goes to flower to hive, and then magically, there's this awesome substance. But obviously, there's a lot of extra steps that come after that bee does its job. And I want to kind of talk about that tonight. So I first want to talk about you guys and your varietals, because you guys are notoriously awesome for having some really unique varietals of honey. Most notably, I'm thinking of, and personally, I used your radish honey recently, and that was a really fun one to play around with. So I want to start by asking you, how are you getting all of these awesome varietals of honey?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, first, I want to give credit to the bees. They do all the hard work and make our job really easy when it comes to collecting varietals. So I think it's important to kind of define what the varietal is. The flavor of these honey varieties comes from the nectar of the flower. We're not adding flavors or colors or anything else to these. The flavor profile that you taste when you order these honeys is representative of the flowers that those bees have visited. And in most cases, these are very pure varietals. They're, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 90%, I would estimate, pure nectar from the floral source. There are some variability here in Oregon. There are some flowers commonly called, weeds, things like dandelions. They bloom like 8 months out of the year here in Oregon. So there's a chance you'll get dandelion honey in every single one of our honeys because it's always blooming. Bees always have access to it. But the way that we get these varietal honeys is by putting beehives into farm fields and into areas where we know that specific flowers are going to bloom at specific times of the year. And we add honey supers, which is the box of honeycomb that goes on top of the colony of bees where they're going to store all this nectar. And by exercising some good timing, we're able to put those supers on and then take those supers off right as that nectar flow comes on, and then take them off before it ends. And that's kind of the real simple answer is just it's timing and placement of the beehives. Like a hobby beekeeper who maybe would just have bees in their backyard, those bees are stationary, they're not moving around. So the honey that you would get from that beehive is just whatever's in that area. And that's it. It's going to be probably the same thing every year. But by having migratory bees where we move the bees around, we can put them where we want and put them in proximity to the crops or flower sources that we want.
Yeah. Well, so to me, it's like, it sounds simple, but I know you're putting so much hard work in those locations. So like, let's take that radish honey, for example. Only because I find it to be so fascinating. Like, I see a radish in my brain, I'm not like, oh, that honey can come from this thing in some form or fashion. So like that one specifically, how are you getting to the point where you're saying this is radish honey in that case?
Yeah, so radish is a row crop. In this case, they're growing radish for seed production. In a lot of cases, radish is used as a rotation crop for grass seed farms. Oregon, in particular, and Oregon's Willamette Valley is known as the grass seed capital of the world. We export an incredible amount of grass seed, and on some specific interval, I think it ranges between 5 and 8 years. The grass seed farms like to rotate a nitrogen fixing crop like radish into their fields. gives the field a nutrient break. It adds some free or low input cost fertilizer for the farmers. And if you like to buy produce at the store that comes from farms, somebody's got to be the farm that grows the seed so we can plant all these radishes. And so the farmers hire beekeepers like ourselves for the service of crop pollination. We're renting the bees. The bees pollinate the crops, which increases the yield of seed or fruits, depending on what they're doing. And I like to see pollination looked on almost like an insurance policy. If you were in a nice rural area and had a small organic plot and lots of native bees and pollinators around, maybe you wouldn't need to rent honeybees. But in most cases, in traditional monoculture agriculture that we kind of live in today, there's not a ton of native bee habitat around. It's just big open fields for large swaths of land. And so we need to bring pollinators in to get good effective pollination. And especially in the early season, radish, I think, would qualify. It's an early crop, early spring crop. Sometimes the weather here in Oregon's not good. And by not good, I mean it's either too hot in the spring, which it was last week, cooked a lot of our meadowfoam crop off this year. Oh, or it's raining all of April. I think we got like 27 days of straight rain in April this year. And there are just a few nice days for the bees to come out of their colony, or excuse me, out of their hive and pollinate. And if you're a farmer, you really need to capitalize on those couple of days to get your pollination set. Otherwise, you just miss the window of opportunity when that crop is in bloom. So that's why we're bringing bees out for the pollination service. And as a byproduct of that service, we're also getting a honey crop. Not every crop produces honey, and we don't collect honey off every crop. Some of the honeys we're not as interested in. At the Honeybee Ranch, we're specifically looking for those unique varietals, the honeys that taste different from one another. And radish was actually one of our most popular honeys this last year. It's got a real light, sweet taste to it. It doesn't taste anything like radish, really. So that's kind of nice.
It has a little spice to it too. I noticed like a subtle
radish or
spice.
Yeah, there's just like a little bit right at the end, I think. So we put honey supers on for that crop. And when I'm moving bees out of radish into the next crop, we would pull those honey supers off, and those will get extracted separate from everything else for the year. And the big science is kind of a secret. I'll let it out of the bag. We do a taste test at the end of the year, and I'm matching up what I have those honey supers labels as, and making sure it tastes like what I have it marked as.
So I was going to ask you, you beat me to it because you explained it, but I was going to say, how do you cooperate with the farmer to say like, hey, I'm going to get that. Do you just like set your bees close and go, I hope you're going to go over there? But the fact that you are renting them out is even more interesting. I never thought about that being a thing, that you're like, obviously it is a mutual benefit for you guys to help them, and they have the whole process where they're hopefully going to get a better crop out of the end, but you're also getting the honey. That is super interesting that you can rent out bees.
Yeah, and the season starts early in Oregon. We're barely out of winter when peaches come into bloom, which is in usually late February. It can be in early March, but typically it's late February that is the first set of bees to go out. They move into the orchard trees like pears and apples and plums and cherries. Bees are in blueberries now, coming out of blueberries and going into meadowfoam. Meadowfoam had a rough year. A lot of folks are interested in that honey. It is a uniquely Oregon honey, so a lot of folks probably have found us for that. And unfortunately, this year we had some really hot weather, which is a tragedy because it was primed to be a really good meadowfoam year. Sometimes the wild invasive Himalayan blackberry blooms at the same time that the meadowfoam crop blooms. And when the bees bring in both of those nectars at the same time, that honey quickly gets diluted with a berry finish. And the honey connoisseurs out there really are after that pure, vanilla, marshmallowy metafoam taste. And this year was looking real good. The bloom was going to be a solid week and a half to 2 weeks ahead of blackberry bloom, and everything was looking good. And we got some unusually hot 90-degree plus days for about a week here in Oregon. And it just really roasted those blossoms. They're just delicate little flowers, and they don't tolerate those real high temperatures for being so early in the spring.
Man, so meadow foam is so fun to me because it is what, like you're saying, it has a lot of the marshmallow, like kind of artificial, sugary, like cotton candy vibes to me. And I played around actually with y'all's meadow foam honey, trying to do a s'mores mead, and I was like, how can I achieve, marshmallow? How can I do this in a way that's not me throwing in um actual marshmallows into a brew? And so I've tried to do it in like a natural manner. And meadow foam is really fun, but to anyone wanting to do that, s'mores mead with meadow foam honey is a waste of that honey because it just gets demolished by everything else. So I would not recommend you try that. It might be worth it to just get some of the whatever that is, the actual marshmallow cream stuff, and just throw it in there to get that flavor. But meadow foam is really fun. And I was looking at your website. I think I have bought and used probably 80% of the honeys you have listed here. And meadow foam was one of my favorites. You at one point you had a caramelized carrot blossom honey, which I'm going to come back to in a second because I'm curious about the backstory behind that one. But then I've also found like your fireweed honey is really fun as well. Raspberry. What was the other one? Um, I think it was your blueberry honey as well, like you're talking about. Those are all really fun, and the story behind them is cool. It makes this process more fun when I get to now talk to you and go like, oh, he was out there like actually he had 2 weeks to get this honey going, and I get this byproduct now. And I hope that people see that and hear this and go, oh, this is like really cool. You have a backstory for where these honeys come from instead of just not thinking about it.
I was going to say too, I'm going to pull my website up here real quick so I don't miss any of the varieties. But I think it's also important to say that not all of the honeys come from farm crops. Many of them do. Most beekeepers, commercial beekeepers, start out as, or certainly make their living in the United States as crop pollinators. Pollination services is typically where a commercial beekeeper really is able to make a living. Honey sales for most commercial beekeepers is really challenging. The beekeeping part of the business takes up so much time, and it is difficult to wear all the hats, to do farmers markets and web sales and meet and work with mead makers and also run thousands of colonies of bees that some of these larger beekeepers than us do. And a lot of them are just pollinators. That's commercial pollinators. But sometimes we're taking bees to non-agricultural crops. So the blackberry blossom was one of them I was going to mention, and there is fireweed honey, which is a high elevation mountain wildflower. And we did not get it this year, unfortunately, but sometimes we get a maple blossom. It's coming from big leaf maple trees. And that honey is highly variable based on the weather. Sometimes we get some nice dry weather in the month of April. The big leaf maple typically blooms in late April and the first part of May. And if we get some nice weather, the bees really prefer that flower. Most people probably never even seen a big leaf maple flower. They're very tiny. They're little tiny red flowers that grow in the canopy of the tree. Really difficult to see them unless you're in the canopy of a maple tree. But the crop that we typically put bees in around that time is blueberries, and the blueberries have a difficult flower for European honeybees to pollinate. They have to, so the blueberries have an upside down, like bell shaped flower, and the honeybees have to kind of hang upside down and push their face into the flower to spread the petal out to get their proboscis in there to get that nectar. And the bees just don't want to work that hard. I think they prefer the easy maple if they can. In fact, some years it's kind of funny. I have some farmers that get really upset because we bring bees out, and blueberries are a unique crop. They take some of the most hives per acre in terms of rentals. And sometimes we'll put the bees out, and the bees immediately just fly out the box and leave the field. And they're out hunting for that big leaf maple, and the farmers get kind of annoyed by that because they're renting bees, and the bees are real reluctant to work blueberries sometimes. So, so anyway, maple honey is another one of those wild honeys. And the last one I was going to mention was Scotch broom. Those are just some of the non-crop honeys.
I haven't tried Scotch broom yet, but it's funny you're saying that the farmers are mad because you're like, what can I do? These are wild animals, like they're gonna go off and do what they want. It's that's funny.
Well, and the unfortunate answer for them sometimes is to just put in a higher density of hives. By increasing the density, it sort of forces the honeybees to forage on the available food in the area. And when we have a lot of colonies in an area, it kind of forces them to forage on the blueberry because the maple's already getting overran by the rest of the bees. So, but that's not an answer a farmer wants to hear because that means they have to pay to rent more bees.
Yeah, I can understand the frustration there, but it's the price you pay. I mean, I feel like the experienced farmers probably know that. The first time farmers are probably like, like shaking their fist when they go through it, the first time.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about that carrot blossom caramelized.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's the story behind that?
Well, first of all, carrot's my favorite honey. And I thought about whether I should say that on a recorded line because I'm really I'm really partial to all the honeys. But if I had to pick one, I like carrot the most. And the caramelized carrot is just this really exceptional product that we offer. We don't offer all the honeys caramelized. I started caramelized honeys a couple of years ago by accident. We, in the process of harvesting honey, when the honey goes through the honey extractor, it goes through a little baffle that has a water jacketed heated tank there, and it acts as a wax separator. And when we're done for the day and we turn this stuff off, the tank doesn't always get turned off, and this honey sort of sits in there and just stays heated overnight for days or weeks on end. And when we're done, we pull the wax off, and this remaining honey is sort of caramelized. And in the old days, years ago, I remember working with my uncle. We used to throw that honey away. We literally dump it out in the field. It was just like we didn't know what to do with it. The bees, don't like caramelized honey, and I'll admit I didn't even know what mead was back then, let alone that you could use it for something. And it's really interesting because in the last decade, I can't believe how many things I've found out that people use that I used to throw away. The products of the hive, there's absolutely no waste. There's nothing that comes from a beehive that somebody won't use for something. And it's really incredible. There's a zero waste system with honeybees. So anyway, that got me thinking about caramelized honey. And as I discovered mead and started to realize that there's an incredible amount of people making mead out there, I discovered that some folks are intentionally caramelizing it. And I remember very distinctly, I don't remember the guy's name, but I remember a customer years ago that bought some really expensive fireweed honey, and he burnt it severely, like to the point it wasn't usable. And I felt bad because he had spent a lot of money on that shipment of honey, and he was basically coming back to order another round to start over. And I wondered if maybe we could help in that process somehow. And so now we purposely caramelize some of the honeys in a larger vat in a controlled environment, so that we're in control of the heat on it. And basically, we're offering the honey already caramelized, so that you, as a customer, don't have to buy this expensive honey and risk burning it and then throwing it away or something. Um, Anyways, so that was kind of the idea behind it. It's difficult for us because we like to do it in a larger batch so that we can make the most of our time, and I try to choose some of the honeys that mead makers request the most. And I think last year we did 3 or 4 varieties. I think we did carrot, I think clover, and maybe a wildflower blackberry, something like that. Some of the more common varieties.
So I when I first bought it, I didn't know you intentionally did it. I kind of thought in my head, I was like, I feel like this was, like you said, and almost an accidental thing. Like, oh no, this honey. But to hear that you are doing it intentionally is, I mean, it's kind of cool that you're servicing the mead community in a different way, because you're right. There are people who are bochet, caramelizing this honey, and you're kind of taking away a little bit of that fear that comes with it, because it is pretty tough when you go a little too far with your caramelizing point. And I've done it, and it's you can't really fix it. There's no turnaround. There's no fixing the burnt honey that you've caused. So I think that's really fun. And I love that you did carrot blossom, because carrot blossom, like you said, is your favorite. It's also it's up there in one of mine, but it's not quite my top. It is such an interesting honey that has so much like actual spice to it that it almost feels like you've thrown some baking spice or allspice or something in there. It's wild to me. I
Yeah,
can't. Yeah.
um, it's a super interesting honey, and I will say that I think it's kind of known in the honey world, and mead makers are probably aware of it too. That carrot honey for a long time has been considered what we call a baker's honey or baker's grade. It's just kind of a low quality honey, or less desired, and it often wholesales at a much lower price on the wholesale markets. And that really baffled me, because when I started working with carrot honey for the first time, I was like, I don't see why people don't like this honey. I really like this honey. I will admit it's not the sweetest honey. It's not candy like Metafoam is, or have a light berry taste like lots of the honeys do. It's a rich root flavor. It has that kind of spice to it, a little into caramel or something. Or there's just it's a real rich root flavored honey, and I like to use it at home in my kitchen for cooking and baking. It's kind of like my go-to honey all the time. And I really hated that it got this bad rap as being like this undesirable honey. And I have spent almost a decade promoting carrot honey, and I think in that time I have seen a real change in people's perception of carrot honey. And I think how people talk about things makes such a huge difference. If everybody says, it's not a good honey, everybody just believes that. They pick it up on every little YouTube channel or article they read, or Mead some they pick all these little things up, and then they kind of build this thought in their head that this honey's not any good. But I would encourage everybody that's watching to try out honeys, even if somebody says that they're not that good of honey. I would say make that judgment for yourself. There are certainly some honey varieties out there that are not my favorites. But I hate when I see honeys get bashed before folks get a chance to try them. So
Yeah. Well, so one of my favorite things to do making mead is taking a new honey to me and making a traditional mead to really highlight the characters you're going to get from it, because I feel like that's you're honoring the bees in that way. You're like, okay, well, I'm going to make sure that their hard work is demonstrated in a way. You're also getting to experience, carrot blossom honey, traditional mead, to see what it does. And then I like to do a recipe of sorts. And so, I'll start to see, I'll try that carrot blossom honey and go, oh, it's got spice, this sort of spice vibe to it. What can I pair with it that will go well? and then you try a recipe. So in all my videos I do with a new honey, I always do a traditional and a recipe. And sometimes, my recipe I make is good. Sometimes it's like, it's okay. But having the base character for these honeys is super important. And as you're saying, experiencing them is also very important. It's a great way to like develop your palate. Like I'm sure that you've gotten really good at honey tasting because you've tasted so many different ones. And that's the same thing for mead makers. The only way you're going to get better at tasting things is to taste more things and to try more things.
Yeah, and I suppose one advantage I have over most of the mead makers out there is honey never goes bad ever, and I don't know that that's necessarily true for meads. Uh, I like to drink mead and have had many that get better with time, but honey doesn't expire ever, and I have some samples that I have collected from our hives of what I believe to be the most pure varietals. I am very confident. Carrot is actually one of the easiest honeys to get a pure varietal. It grows in Oregon's central high desert, and it is very isolated from anything else growing. They irrigate those carrots out there, and there just isn't much else growing out on the desert or blooming at that time. So there's not much opportunity for anything else to get in that honey variety. And in those scenarios, I'll set aside samples. I mark the year, and I use them as a reference tool each season when we go to harvest honeys. I do feel like I'm pretty good at tasting honeys, but I often use our reference samples to go back and compare it to years that I know to be very pure varietal honeys, and I'll make notes, and when we finally get ready to bottle those honeys and put them online and offer them, sometimes we make adjustments to the descriptions of them. There can be subtle differences. I think that honeys are like wines or anything else. They're highly influenced by the weather and the soil composition and what crop might have been in bloom next door. And so if you were to line, 5 or 6 or 10 years worth of honey varieties all side by side, and they're all the same crop, you might notice that there's actually quite a bit of difference between them. If you only get a jar of honey once a year, you probably would never notice that difference. But if you were to compare them all the years side by side, there are some subtle differences there.
That sounds like another market, vintage honey. This is a
Vintage honey.
10-year aged
Yeah.
raspberry blossom honey. I can imagine some mead makers, that would be like a hot commodity. People would be like, oh, it's vintage. Oh.
Yeah. There are some really exciting vintages out there. Folks can fact check me, and I'll get butchered for my timelines. But the Egyptian tombs, they kind of famous for doing some burials that included honeycomb, and some of that honey is thousands of years old, and likely it came from some extinct plants. And there's some opportunities for some vintage honeys that you cannot get anymore. They're from plants that don't exist, and that would be something really exciting to get my hands on. I'd love to
Throw
get
down a couple. I'm sure a
some
couple million
thousands.
dollars to get 20
Yeah,
pounds of
yeah.
honey from this thing. That would be. I can definitely see that being if I had unlimited money, I would for sure do that. You know what I mean? I would find that weird Egyptian tomb, and I would go ahead and buy that 1 pound of honey and make that mead.
By the pound of honey. That's right. Yeah. And it kind of puts honey in perspective for me a little bit, because over hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of years, I can really only imagine that the honey profiles have changed. I would imagine. I'm assuming honey from 10,000 years ago probably doesn't taste quite the same.
Yeah. So, as the honey expert, you have a lot of experience. You talk about using or having honeys that are older that have probably crystallized. What are your pro tips to Yeah, I'm going to use you guys for example. Let's say I buy a 6 pound. This has happened to me recently, actually. 6 pound half-gallon jug of a specific honey. I forget about it for a while, and it's all crystallized. What do I do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I get that question a lot. And the first thing is don't throw your honey away. I am saddened by how many emails I get about folks that threw their honey away because it went bad. Um, Raw honey should crystallize. Crystallized honey is a good indicator that your honey is pure and raw. The honey is in this super saturated, state that it doesn't want to be in a liquid form. It wants to go back to crystallize. And at room temperature, the honey's going to crystallize pretty quickly. I mean, it depends on the variety. It takes anywhere from weeks to months typically for honeys to crystallize. Once the honey has crystallized in the jar, my recommendation is to heat a pot of water up. Bring a pot of water to a boil, and when that water is at a boil, take it off the heat, and then you can set those jars inside the pot of hot water. Um, in the case of large containers like half gallons or gallons, you might need to repeat that process to get that warming effect. A common misconception with honey is that it should never be heated. The honeybees maintain somewhere around 92 degrees Fahrenheit in their colonies year round. And even here in the Pacific Northwest, we have temperatures well over 100 degrees. I think last summer we got a couple of days around 115 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that honey is exposed to some really high temperatures. And sitting at room temperature, we're keeping the honey actually, probably 20 degrees lower than what the bees would keep it. So that radiant heat from the water, the hot water pot, is not going to ruin the honey. Now, if you boil the honey itself or put it in a frying pan and cook it, or you do a Bochet style mead where you're literally caramelizing the sugars, yeah, you're definitely going to break down some of the proteins and nutrient value of the honey there. But a little warm water bath is not going to hurt the honey at all. That's my best
Yeah.
recommendation.
Well, I've experienced that. You guys sell lots of different quantities of honey, and I've often bought like 6 pounds, which is half-gallon for lots of people who don't know. And that comes in a half-gallon, like milk jug kind of situation. Look, and when that crystallizes, that little spout at the top is hard to get honey out of. So you have to do something to heat it up to get that honey out. And so I've done what you're saying, hot water. Um, I've tried. I've done a little bit, not with the plastic because this would be a bad choice. But when my honey's in like a glass container, I'll put it in the oven at 100 and something degrees and let it just sit in there for a while and just let it kind of warm up that way. And I know some people are losing their mind at that right now because there is. I know there's a lot of taboo against heating honey, and I think that is interesting. I'd love to do more testing to see if there's a difference between a heated honey versus not heated. I did the test a while back, but it wasn't as conclusive as I would want. Um, but crystallizing honey is a real problem, and it is super hard to deal with at the 60 pound uh like size. And I don't even know. Like right now, I've got probably 20 pounds of buckwheat honey sitting in a 30 pounds, whatever it is, I don't know, 2.5 gallon bucket, and it's all crystallized. I'm like, I'm gonna have to figure out how to one day decrystallize that. Luckily, it's a bucket, so you can just scoop. That's the resolve there. But I'm glad you've given us some tips to know what to do whenever we run into that issue now.
Yeah, and buckets are a bigger challenge. Obviously, we send out quite a few of the 2 gallon pails, and I get a lot of questions about how to heat those. And for folks at home, a common remedy to that I see, the water bath is an option. You can like plug the sink and put hot water in there. I also see folks set the buckets on a heater vent, maybe a furnace in the house or something, or next to the wood stove. That kind of you're just looking for that radiant heat. You're not trying to get the honey up to a high temperature. You just need something probably around 90 or 100 degrees Fahrenheit to just start to reliquefy that honey a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that whoever's dealing with that right now, because there's someone listening right now who's like, "Oh crud, I got to figure out how to fix this," has a couple tips to go forth. I want to talk about this stuff I don't know about. This is dipping into territory I have I know nothing about. Moisture and bees in the hive specifically. Can you kind of talk about what bees need as far as moisture content to be productive?
Yeah. So when you say moisture, I just want to make sure I understand the question right. You're talking about like feeding them water, or are you talking about like moisture, like hurting the bees?
I heard, yeah. So I heard, what was it? Was it when it was too cold? Who was I talking to the other day? When it was, they were talking about it was snowing and their beehives and like all these things, and because the moisture had changed so much that it actually ended up hurting the bees. So
Okay.
that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And we battle moisture problems in the colonies in the winter in the Pacific Northwest very often. I know that some beekeepers prefer to leave their bees up on Oregon's high desert because although it's much colder there, the relative humidity and just precipitation is a lot less. And they get a lot more snow out there, not so much rain. Here in the Willamette Valley, we get these kind of long, wet, and more often than not, mild winters. We're not really getting super cold winters much anymore, and the colonies are trying to stay warm all winter, and they cluster up into something like basketball sized group of bees, and they get real tightly together to stay warm. And the honeybees, when they're breathing, their exhale collects as condensation on the roof of the beehive, and those that condensation will form water droplets, and it can drip back down on the cluster of bees. And now the bees are getting wet from their own condensation. And then we dip into some cold nights. In the Willamette Valley, we often will get a little bit below freezing, but there are times we get down in the low 20s. And when we get into those real cold temperatures and we're dealing with wet bees, they just don't have the ability to keep themselves warm. And to kind of give a comparison, humans, we can get hypothermic in 50 or 60-degree temperatures if we're wet. But if we're dry, we can withstand much colder temperatures, and the bees are up against the same challenge. So how do we deal with that? Well, there's a whole bunch of ways beekeepers can try to mitigate moisture problems. We can insulate the colonies, we can vent them. There are boxes we put on top called moisture boxes or wintering inner covers, or there's a variety of different names for them, but you can put in wicking materials like wood chips or burlap or something that's going to like wick away that moisture away from the bees, and then in combination with some vents up there will kind of vent out that moisture. Providing good upper insulation is one technique to kind of put a barrier between that temperature difference inside and outside the colonies so the condensation doesn't build up so much. There is some bee keeping supply manufacturers out there now that are coming out with some like curved roof designs to try to like just knowing that moisture is going to drip or trying to drip it away from the cluster of bees. There's some real interesting stuff coming out now trying to battle that moisture problem. Um, uh, with our beehives, I typically use popsicle sticks or sticks off the ground. And sometimes if I'm noticing moisture buildup in the colonies, I crack the lid on my beehive. And a lot of folks kind of get freaked out by that because we're letting all the heat out of the beehive by doing that. But that moisture will kill the bees a lot faster than letting the heat out will. So sometimes we just have to crack the lid and get a little airflow in there to dry that colony out.
That is so. I've never really understood that concept. I heard that moisture, and I was like, how can a moisture kill a bee? And but that makes sense though. Obviously, there's a process happening there, and um, that's really that's wild. Also, the fact that there's like so much bee science for the hives happening. How do we combat this? It's kind of wild to me. That's cool. I can see that. I feel like in just a few years' time, we're gonna have enough technology to be able to like keep bees around for longer. Because I know that there is a large worry about the bee population in general. And are you able to speak to any of those things happening?
Yeah, I think I would be comfortable saying that there's an incredible amount of people and agencies and universities and money and energy being put into honeybee research and native bee research and trying to help pollinators in general and combat a lot of these issues that beekeepers face, not only with things like moisture, but with buzzwords, pun totally intended, for things like colony collapse disorder, which we don't really see much of that anymore. I wouldn't say that it doesn't exist, it certainly does. But in my opinion, the parasitic varroa mites are enemy number one for honeybees. It's a
What is
parasitic
that?
mite. It's a parasitic mite brought in from Asia, I believe, sometime in the mid '80s, and it is sort of the equivalent in size of having like a full-grown house cat on you somewhere. So it's a pretty big parasite for the honeybee. And the varroa mites are vectors for a variety of disease and viruses in the colonies. And I think there are about 12 viruses that are currently significantly impacting honeybees in the United States. And there's maybe half of those that we see on a regular basis in our colonies here in the Northwest. Some of them uh, result in some visual signs. There's a virus we call deformed wing virus, and when the adult honeybee is born, she comes out of her cell and her wings are deformed. They're not functional, and we then have like a double negative because not only is that worker bee not going to be a contributing member of the colony, she's actually just going to crawl around and eat honey while she sits in there until she dies off. And so you can imagine the colony can only sustain enough damaged worker bees like that to the point that if they get too many of the viruses, they're going to collapse as a colony. So anyway, so we don't have a control for the viruses, so we're trying to control the vector, which is the parasitic mite. And there's a lot of things we're doing throughout the year to manage for that. I would say it's probably the thing I think about the most in terms of colony management. Um, I don't lose a lot of sleep thinking about moisture problems, although it is a real problem that we deal with. Um, the varroa mites are what bother me the most. We just have a difficult time managing them, and they reproduce really quickly, and they have this ability to adapt and evolve to some of the treatments. Just in the time that I've been a beekeeper, I think there's two, maybe three treatments. These would be miticides that we used to be able to use to treat for these varroa. They're not on the market anymore because the mites have evolved that quickly to
Wow.
become resistant to some of these things. So yeah, these pests are really a big deal for bees and beekeepers. I, and this is a global problem, not just here in the U.S. I don't know. I don't think there are very many places left in the world that don't have varroa mites. I think some of the island states and nations are some of the only ones. I think there are just a couple of Hawaiian islands in the U.S. that don't have varroa mites, but I'm pretty sure every other state does.
Man, I heard about something regarding that. Like I remember maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, like the same time that COVID was really hitting, there was also like people were calling it kind of like bee COVID. And I think that's what you're talking about, is this uncontrollable issue. I'm glad to hear that we're finding the ways to combat it, but it's also kind of wild that the ways we found ways and now they don't work anymore. And it's just, I mean, it's just like vaccines for us, just like all those other things. And so I sure hope that they come out with some more, um, for lack of a better term, medicine or ways to help that, because uh, I don't know what we would do without bees or without honey, obviously, as mead makers. I know that bees are, I think most people know this, but they're like some of the most important insects for the whole world in general, being pollinators. I don't know what we would do without them. Um, and I think that we kind of forget about that because most people see a bee and they get scared of it because it's like, well, it's going to sting me. And to be fair, I'm the same way. When I see one, even as somebody who loves like love honey, I still see a bee and I'm like, oh no, like it's gonna get me. But obviously, that's not the end of the world.
Yeah, I think Einstein has a famous quote, which I won't be able to repeat word for word, but it's something about, if the bees die, we'll die shortly after or something. And I don't think that the loss of honeybees would be an immediate cause of the food systems collapse, but it would be incredible. I mean, honeybees are responsible for something like 2/3 of all the produce that we consume on a global scale. And that's a really big deal. And obviously, we use honey in mead, but we're often using fruits too. And the bees are responsible for that component as well. So I think that's kind of a big deal. And obviously, our food system is a big deal. And the globe is very accustomed to getting fresh fruits and produce year round, even though we don't, necessarily grow them locally. And that's a big thanks to bees that we're able to produce so much food. So I also have some big hopes that there's some saving graces out there for the bees. Interestingly, I think that the number of colonies of bees in the United States continues to increase each year, but what we're really concerned about is the rate of loss. So I don't think it's the number of colonies that we lose each year is the biggest number to worry about. I think it's the rate of loss. I don't know that I can speak to the exact numbers, but I just listened to some survey results last night at a local bee club meeting, and hobby beekeepers were losing an average of 40% of their colonies each year. And that's a lot. That's actually down from the year before where it was around 50. But you can imagine hobby beekeepers are losing basically 50% of their bees every year. That's a
Wow.
lot. And commercial beekeepers tend to be lower, probably because they're more actively managing for those varroa mites and viruses. But even if you were at 15 or 20% loss, if you think about the biggest honey producing beekeepers out there, they're running thousands of colonies. And if you're losing 20%, it means you're losing hundreds of colonies, if not more. That's a lot of lost colonies in a year just from varroa mites alone.
And that's that's a lot of stress. I'm not gonna lie. I'm very thankful that you are here and you have the expertise to do this, because I don't think I could, even as a hobby beekeeper, like I'd be stressed out all the time. Now knowing even more about it, I'd be like, oh my gosh, like do I need to go out and check it like every day? Like I'd be trying to baby it all the time and stressed out. So I'm glad that you guys have the expertise to produce great honey and help to, I guess, to collect great honey, not necessarily produce. But we're super thankful to have the varieties you guys have as well. I want to back up to process a little bit, because there was, you talked about bees eating the honey. So whenever you're collecting honey out of a hive, obviously bees have to eat some of that honey. Do you take every bit of it from the hive? Is it based off of the time of year? Like, how do you navigate those waters?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We do not take all of the honey from the colonies. I would say on average, we're leaving about 40 pounds of honey for the colonies to overwinter with. We do feed the bees sugar water, just cane sugar and water mixed together. We feed that in the early springtime, especially around the time like this time of year. We've just gotten finished splitting our colonies. We make what we call nukes, which stands for nucleus hive. They're little small colonies that we divide to replace our own winter losses, and we also supply some for hobby beekeepers as a way to get started with bees. And then we're feeding in the late fall, just trying to make sure that in addition to that approximately 40 pounds of honey that we've left, that they definitely have enough food to get through winter. I think it just in my experience as a beekeeper, losing a colony of bees to starvation is the worst way for a colony to go. I feel like as a beekeeper, I have a lot of control, almost 100% control over whether my colony starves to death or not. I don't feel like I have a lot of control sometimes over the issues surrounding varroa and viruses. Even when we do everything we think we're supposed to do, of course, just by the book, we still lose colonies. But starving bees, I can do a lot about that. I can put some sugar in there or some sugar water, so we do feed the bees. I think it's a really important thing to note, especially for the mead makers. We're not feeding our bees while there are honey supers on the hive. So in a normal year, which I'm not sure what that is anymore, but normally in April, we're putting honey supers on, certainly by May. And at that time, we stop feeding the bees. We don't want sugar water stored in the honey super, which is eventually going to be extracted and bottled for sale. So we're not feeding them at that time. But when the supers are not on the hives, we're feeding them because any honey they're storing in those lower brood boxes is always honey that those bees are going to keep. In our operation, we don't extract honey from our brood frames. There are many beekeepers that do that, and it's okay to do that in a lot of cases. But we are using those mite treatments in those lower brood boxes, and I eat every single one of the varieties that you can see on our website myself, and I'm not interested in eating mite treatments, so I don't use I don't put our honey supers on at that time, and we're certainly not feeding at that time either.
Yeah. So how much, obviously there's going to be a bunch of different sizes of beehives. I have no doubt about that. I'm sure there's a more standard, I don't, do you have a universal size that you generally are rolling with? And if so, how much honey are you normally collecting from a single hive?
Yeah, it's a good question. I got a little prop here. I'm going to pull it out and see if
I love props.
see if the camera will pick this up. It's one of my favorite toys. I'll move my camera just a little bit here.
Oh, if you're an audio
Can you
only
see it?
listener, you hop on over to the YouTube and you can see this prop.
Let me back it up here a little bit. So this is my beehive. I hope you guys
Okay.
can see the delineations here, but the two lower boxes are what we call a brood chamber. These boxes are larger. They take a 9 1/8 inch frame, which is made of wood, has a plastic foundation or inner, kind of the insert, and the bees draw honeycomb out on this. And the honey that the bees put in these two lower boxes is what we're leaving for the bees for the winter time. The boxes up here on top, there are two of them in this little prop. These are the honey supers. This is where the surplus honey that we would harvest and take from the bees would be stored. And these boxes are the ones, when I say we're adding a honey super, this is what I'm talking about, where we stop feeding when these boxes go on. So the honey you mentioned earlier in the discussion was radish. So when I take my bees out to the farm field, they actually go out in something that looks similar to this. So they're what we call a double deep. two deep box configuration. And when I get them to the farm field, I'm going to put on one of these honey supers. So my beehive now looks like this, and that box is full of already drawn out honeycomb from the previous year, and it just takes the bees almost no time at all to get started filling this box, which we call honey super, full of nectar. The difference between nectar and honey is the moisture content and whether the bees have dehydrated it. Honeybees cap honey cells at around 18.5% moisture. You guys are probably all familiar with the Brix scale. We use that to, using a refractometer, we can measure the moisture content of the honey. And once all this honey is capped off, that tells me as the beekeeper that honey is ready to harvest. And when we come out of radish, I would come out and take this honey super off. It gets set aside for later in the summer when we extract. And when I move them into the next crop, the new honey super that's empty goes on. And my radish one is still back over here, set aside for the summer. And we kind of go through that a couple times a year. We like to get 3 honey boxes off a colony in a season. It can be more, it can be less. Just depends on what the crop is and how good the weather and soil conditions are. And there's a ton of variables, just like infinite variables that determine a honey crop. I think you mentioned the size of the colonies. I would say the average colony of bees is maybe 40 or 50,000 bees in a setup like this. I think it could be as many as 60,000. So that's a lot of individual bees in there, and it's certainly hundreds of thousands or millions of bees pollinating a crop at any given time. So that's a lot of bees. But that's the standard typical hive configuration is something like this. Like a mead recipe, there's dozens of ways to do it different.
Yeah. So like your super boxes there, roughly, obviously, I feel like there's a lot of variables to this. How much are you generally harvesting from one box?
Yeah, I would say roughly 30 pounds. Can be
Okay.
a little bit more, can certainly be less. Inside the box, if anybody is not familiar with what a honey super looks like, see if the camera will pick up my frames, but there's actually texture on there. So that texture represents the honeycomb. And inside the box, there's 8 or 10 frames, depending on how the beekeeper has configured their box. We actually run 9 in our honey supers. It makes uncapping the honeycomb a little easier. So there's 9 frames in there, and that holds approximately 30 pounds of honey.
Wow. Well, I think that's an important thing for people to see too. Like when I buy a lot of honey, and it's not uncommon for me to go through 60 pounds of honey in a short amount of time if I'm making a lot, So to have a visualization of, oh, that's roughly, 2 super boxes worth of bees work is it's pretty wild to me, but also important. Again, it is a new appreciation for what you guys do and what the bees are doing in that whole process. I love that you guys have so many different varietals, and that's part of your passion for this hobby is not just like, I feel like it'd be easy just to produce a lot of clover or wildflower or something that might be, or one varietal itself that is local to you. But you guys do such a great job of demonstrating the vast options you have. And one thing I'm for sure going to do, and down in the description of this video and of the audio podcast will be the link to Flying Bee Ranch. But you should check out all of their varietals. I've used probably 80% of the ones on here, and there are a few more that I have yet to get. Like I've been still searching out for the day that you have canola honey, and what was the other one? Sage honey, and the Scotch broom, which is in stock. So I need to eventually just go ahead and purchase some of that are in stock right now. But those are the ones I think I haven't used that are kind of fun and more rare for sure to get.
Yeah, the canola for us in the Pacific Northwest is a little more rare. I think that honey is more common, certainly in Canada, and maybe around the Great Lakes states. I did want to mention that when we talk about the volume of honey that the bees get, it is highly variable depending on where the bees are in the country. Some of the bees that come from like the states, like the Dakotas, North Dakota, I think, is one of the largest honey producing states in the country. And I think those colonies there average something like 150 pounds of honey or something per year. It's a whole lot of honey, and I think that the bees here in the Pacific Northwest maybe average, you know, half of that much, maybe 60 to 90 pounds is maybe average. And it can be less. I mean, in a poor honey crop year, it could be less than that. So, but there's a wide varying degree. I think I've heard this number many times, and I don't know where it comes from, but in Oregon, I have heard that the record honey crop was set in a city called Dallas, which is maybe 30 minutes drive west of us, and it's something like 430 pounds of honey on one colony. So
Wow.
I actually believe that number. I think that it was possible. I don't know that that's possible today. I don't think that the weather conditions and the available nectar sources would allow for that much honey on a colony today. But never say never. That
Yeah.
would be my best day ever.
That's a fun like Guinness World Record to try and achieve is like the most honey on a hive. That's another one of those that I've never thought about. 400 pounds, that's a lot of honey for one colony. That's man.
Yeah, and I think the world record is probably higher than that. I don't know how you get more honey than that. I think it would be difficult with one single colony, just one queen and her workers. That's a lot of honey. Uh, a 5 gallon bucket holds 60 pounds of honey. So you're talking about, 6 or 8 5 gallon buckets or more. I mean, that's an incredible amount. That'd be really impressive to see that.
Yeah. And well, Jeremy, thank you for your time. I am going to be pushing everyone listening right now. If you want to get some great honey that's quality, that's also more unique varieties than you might have around you. Like for me right now, I have wildflower and clover. If I just use local honey, which I'm going to, but if I just use that, I'd never really be branching out into new territory. Check out Flying Bee Ranch. They are online, and I think, do you have a storefront for anyone local?
Yeah, yeah, we do have a storefront. It's open year round.
So if you're local, feel free to check out their storefront. But I feel like most people are going to be buying online. You guys do a fantastic job of shipping. I've bought from you guys many times, and every time it's always, I've never had any damaged boxes. It's always been very quality service, and I can attest to that. So if you'd like to go and support them, Delcy wasn't with us tonight, but she's also the other half of Flying Bee Ranch, and I guarantee you that she's working just as hard as Jeremy and knows just as much as Jeremy. So you can go and support them. Thank you for your time. This has been a lot of fun, and I know that people are going to love this episode.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to talk about bees anytime.
Well, I know I've learned a lot, and I have a grand new appreciation for what you guys do and for the whole process in itself. So if you would like to support them, again, go there. If you'd like to chat with Jeremy, I'm sure that it's info@flyingbeeranch.net. If you have more questions, was it .net or .com?
Yep, .net. Yeah, shoot us
.net.
an email or reach out on social media. We're happy to connect and talk about bees and bridal honeys all the time.
Yeah. If I missed a question that you're like, oh, I wish you'd asked that, feel free to reach out because he definitely knows. Jeremy's the guy. He's my my bee info guy now. So I'll be calling you more often.
Thanks,
so, hey, well, thank you for your time, and I'll let you go. But I hope that people will go and support you and get some good honey from Flying Bee Ranch. So I'll chat with you soon.
Thanks.
Cheers.